So I've always been fascinated with the ability to create outcomes from an idea. I remember back in kindergarten when I was coloring outside the lines, and I would imagine in my head what color palette to use and actually just kind of create that. And that was really interesting to me because it was the first time that I consciously engaged this idea that something could happen that originated inside of my head. I also remember volunteering in a soup kitchen, and I grew up in a rough neighborhood myself, and I never really knew exactly when we were going to have our next meal. So when I was able to volunteer and I was able to relieve some of that stress about figuring out when your next meal was going to come from, I really felt excited to be able to actually have an impact in someone else's life. That agency around creating this experience or this nourishment for someone else was fascinating to me, and I recognized that public service and just having my space in this place will actually allow me to create outcomes in that way as well. And then I remember also when I finally turned 18 and I could actually vote for the first time in a presidential election. I was super excited because I had just spent the last 4 years of my life doing competitive policy debate, and I had all these ideas about the way the world should be run, at least in the United States. So I was excited to express this agency. Unfortunately, I wasn't super excited about the candidates, so that excitement was somewhat mitigated. But nonetheless, it was the first major step that I could take in sort of a political environment to have agency. So really, agency to me is extraordinary. It's just amazing ability to claim humanity. It's an amazing ability to claim your space outside of your head. And frankly, it is the way in which we can actually aggregate together to create institutional outcomes and outcomes individually. And the reason why this is important to me as a person who thinks about markets and economics is because I think that markets are collections of different agents that come together to think about and actually organize distribution systems. And increasingly, what I've found as I historically look back to different markets is that markets that have people who have, or agents who have a ton of agency are generally the most robust and the ones that are most likely to provide goods and services in abundance and in an equitable way. So, agency is really important in this way too. And it couldn't be more important than where we are today, because governments all across rich countries are debt-ridden, and they have less ability to actually support and sort of move forward the economic agenda that they have because their institutional agency has been reduced by these debt handcuffs. So as I think about civic agency, the ability to vote and the ability to actually have people participate in the political process, I think about two generic categories: institutional agency, which are our judicial system, our republic here in the United States, democracy elsewhere, and then individual agency, the ability to serve on school boards, the ability to sort of have conversations, facilitate debates in your own homes with your own friends, etc. As I think about that in relationship to our economic agency, I'm actually really surprised because most of us have varying levels of economic agency, and even more so as we think about the limits in our institutions right now, we have even less. So I'm going to pause right there and have you guys work through this with me so I can sort of illustrate an example about what I'm working on, what my company's doing, and what some others are doing. So where we are right now, how many of you guys live in a community where you, by a show of hands, you live in a community where you get some sort of small business to sell you something, whether it's a coffee or it's an auto mechanic that replaces something on your car? By a show of hands, how many people have that sort of experience? How many of you guys own a small business or know someone who owns a small business? So a lot of people also. So beyond the small business that you own, right, how many of you are actively participating in the process of getting capital, of resources to the small businesses in your community? Almost no one, which is surprising. So if you're not doing it, you don't have any sort of individual agency in the sort of community capital market, how many of you think that there are real institutional solutions to getting getting other business owners besides yourselves access to capital? How many of you think there's institutional solutions to that? So there's a couple hands, which is somewhat encouraging because I thought it might be even actually less. So where we are right now in at least the American economy is that small businesses across the country have been somewhat systematically precluded from participating in capital markets. If you think about your traditional balance sheet, you'd have your assets on your right-hand side and your liabilities and equity on your left-hand side. And what you'd find for a big corporation like the ones I used to advise working on Wall Street is that they had access to equity financing through IPOs and private equity investors. They had access to debt from bank lenders, things called mezzanine finance, and all other types of debt securities. And they had access to derivative contracts to support their liabilities and equities, whether that be options or collateralized default swaps or something like that. But they really had a robust sort of platform from which they can go to the capital markets where there's these global financial flows and actually figure out how they were going to capitalize their assets. So flipping sort of the script to the small business side, which, by the way, makes up 50% of America's payrolls, what I found was that these folks can't access equity unless they put it in themselves, unless they find someone who's an accredited investor, which is a very unique role that only something like 10% of Americans actually have access to. They really have a hard time finding sort of private equity investors for that reason, but public equity investors is even more difficult because small businesses can't traditionally access public markets very easily, at least at the federal level, and even less so at the state level because there's so many different types of laws and it's really arduous. And then on the debt side, things were going okay, right? We have credit card products that people could use. We have small business loans. We have a small business administration that even guarantees these loans. But over the last year, what we found is that 74% of small businesses who actually applied for loans were denied that opportunity. And according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, only 6 out of 10 small businesses say that they're undercapitalized. So what we found is that they really don't have access to debt capital either. And these are institutional failings, right? They don't have access to the same sort of institutional capital markets as do their larger peers. So interestingly enough, our institutions that should have agency in these spaces can't figure out how to make the appropriate connections. So as I think about my experience in kindergarten or volunteering or voting, the key piece for me was that there's actually, in the absence of institutional agency, the ability to have individual agency. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about these really interesting new ideas that allow individuals to connect to small businesses who traditionally don't have access to these capital markets to build more exciting communities where small businesses can play a role in not only delivering goods and services, but actually connecting with folks such that individuals have agency in those community capital markets. So there's actually a whole host of opportunities, and I think maybe some of you may have heard of these before. Kiva.org. If you've heard of it, just raise your hand just so I can get a feeling. So people have heard of Kiva.org. For those of you who haven't, it's a platform that allows folks from rich countries to give little amounts to entrepreneurs in poor countries, third world countries. There's another platform called Kickstarter. Have people heard of Kickstarter? So Kickstarter, for those of you who don't know it, connects people who have projects with people who are interested in being donors and allows them on a peer-to-peer way to connect. So there's a capital markets for the creative economy. And then there's another business called ProFounder. People heard about ProFounder? Not so much. So ProFounder is actually co-founded by the co-founder of Kiva.org, and it allows small businesses or first-time entrepreneurs to raise capital from folks with the promise of giving them parts of their revenue streams. So there's these really new, interesting ideas, but the one that I want to talk about, obviously, because I'm starting the company, is stock, which is short for social stock. So all the other platforms that I talked about just for a brief second are platforms that aren't really are not really for small businesses, or they require small businesses to go through really complicated securities law and compliance law. And so stock is actually very different. It works similar to a small business loan, although it's not a small business loan. It's actually technically a deferred revenue. But the way that it works is similar in that instead of borrowing from a bank, you get financing from your best customers, and instead of paying out interest charges, you pay out stock dividends in the form of goods, services, and special experiences. Typically, the aggregate value of those sort of dividends are in excess of what you've bought as a stock shareholder, and so you actually get meaningful economic returns. So why is this important? Well, beyond the fact that it's really important for small businesses to get access to capital, and it's really important for individuals because they get these amazing deals, or they get these amazing experiences, or they get access to these services in a way that's a return to their investment. It's actually more important because now, for the first time, we're able to democratize community growth. We're saying that instead of having a central planner, or instead of having an economic development authority, or having a big corporation or philanthropist own the space of what our communities might look like, and which projects and which businesses actually get funded in our communities that make our communities, we can actually have individuals participate in that process for the first time really ever. As all of you sort of raised your hand, very few of you, if any of you, are even able to make those types of support a reality in the current model. So as we think about this, it's rapidly deployable. You can go back to your own communities, and you can make these sorts of social investments yourselves, and you can organize yourselves around these places and these spaces that you care about in the way that you haven't been able to do before, and that's really, really huge. For the first time, you'll be able to have individual economic agency in the way that you have civic economic agency. And as we think about the first point that I was making at the outset of the conversation, which is that the markets with the most agency produce the most robust interactions, this means that we can now free up capital, we can now support, we can now build these sort of resource pipelines for 50% of America's payrolls. It's also really important because it fundamentally changes the conversation around how people view their role versus institutions. So I'm sure that you guys have all been reading the papers, or if you haven't, maybe someone's mentioned it to you, but this idea of Occupy Wall Street, is that familiar to people? So, exactly. So essentially you have, I guess it's, 20,000 folks, is that right?
Well, the numbers are varied, actually. I mean, the newspaper was, it seems to be that the news is reporting that maybe a couple hundred people are occupying Wall Street, but if you go down there, it's clear that it's several thousand at least.
Okay, so I obviously am not really an expert on the latest and greatest in the movement. What I would say, though, is that I've read that they're hoping that 20,000 will come out. It sounds like there's varied reports.
20,000 at the last march.
Wow. So we have these people in this process vis-a-vis institutions asking for this agency. In this specific case, they're asking for the government, President Obama, to think about and investigate the ways in which Wall Street has access to power in Washington, D.C. But what might that conversation look like if there was a better or more valuable way to exercise institutional agency? What if we didn't necessarily have to create proxy institutions in the form of movements to create the communities that we cared about, to create and defend the agencies that we ought to have in the economic process? I mean, that's just one way in which the democracy here could work and be extended to our political economy beyond just our political process. The second reason why I think this is really powerful is because for the first time as we think about, for the first time as we think about the organizations that provide institutional support, right? So the people who provide the small business loans, the people who provide equity, et cetera, we're actually able to create more interesting and better assets, more healthy balance sheets for small businesses if we participate in this way. So the current relationship between a small business owner and a customer is very transactional. It's based on generating sales and generating revenues from this relationship. But if you're actually a social investor and you've actually taken a stake and you've actually bought something today and will be okay with taking delivery going forward, the balance sheet impact of that is that the equity remains with the small business owner, and the debt actually hasn't gone up or down. It's actually less. And the cash flow metrics in which people think about the riskiness of that debt has improved because you have more customers who are willing to bring in more revenue over the course of the time that they redeem their dividends. And now we can go to Bank of America, or now we can go to the Small Business Administration and say, because we are actively participating and supporting in this business, this is actually a better business for you to lend to. So not only do we increase our own agency, we increase the ability for institutions to better respond to the crisis that we have with American small businesses accessing capital. So, I think that as we look out into the world and we think about the future of what economic development might look like, what markets might look like, what small businesses and other institutions might look like, I think we should be very excited that the promise of individual agency means that we can now democratize economic growth. We can now reduce our reliance on institutional agency and maybe even bolster institutional agency. And that begins with community financing the way forward.